Hi, and welcome to Wisdom for Life, where we sift through the philosophy to find practical advice that you can use in your everyday life. I'm Dan, and I'm joined by my co-host, Dr. Greg Sadler, and today we're talking about
big topic, work, meaning, and the future. And what we mean by this is the fact that work is becoming transformed before our eyes into something quite different than it was, say, a decade ago, let alone, our childhood. So we're facing a world in which there might not actually be enough work for human beings. There definitely will be for the robots and AI and other things that we're going to talk about. So what will the world look like, and how can we adjust ourselves to this or plan for it? What's the prudent thing to do?
And this is a really messy subject because, we're speculating into the future.
Prognosticating, yeah.
Yeah, but we do have some road guides, and we have a number of different paths that we might go down, kind of depending on the situations that we're going to find ourselves in. And as we go through them, we can say, is this a good path or is this not a good path? At least, from a subjective point of view or an objective point of view, for depending on what our criteria is for defining what is a good life for us, and see if we at least know the paths, we can potentially work to try to bring us down to a path that we are all happy with.
Or at least most of us are. I don't think you're going to get everybody on one sheet, especially if there's people who really like being on top and being in control of everything. It's going to be a hard sell to say, well, we should have a Star Trek sort of future, unless they're the admiral in charge of Starfleet, right?
Right.
So
it's interesting that Starfleet has this, for I guess the people on Earth, and for most of the people, it's it's boring, relatively. There's everyone that has real ambition goes to Starfleet, because that's where you get to do wild and crazy things. You get to work on the edge, but when you go back to I run a restaurant, and the people come because I have really good food, but not because I'm making money, because
there is no money in that future, right?
Yeah, it's space capital or space communism, fully automated space communism.
Yeah, and so before we jump in, we should talk a little bit about something we brought up, and I forget which episode it was. We were talking about Star Trek and a post-scarcity future, and this issue of excitement and meaning, and there's another similar sci-fi speculative fiction. I mean, it is a really hard sci-fi series where this is the case as well, and that's Ian Banks' Culture series, right? Mm-hmm. So how do we have this same dynamic where you got a really soft, gooey inside, and then on the outside shell you've got a hard, we could say honor and integrity driven, also pretty competitive set of people who are protecting it, and they kind of support each other, right? All the economic stuff is coming from this massive dynamo of human beings who are, the technology's there so they can replicate anything, but they also really love what they do, even though it's not exciting most of the time. Some of them are musicians, and some of them are, like you said, restaurant owners, and presumably some of them are,
game masters.
Yeah, exactly. But you can't have it because you've got all these other races, right? In Star Trek, it's the Klingons until they become effectively domesticated and part of the Federation, right? And then you've got the Romulans, the next baddies, and then the Cardassians, and a few things like the Borg, who will never truly be assimilated until, I don't know, maybe they are in the new Picard thing, right? Mm-hmm. So
they're the post-Borg.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. They've assumed a semi-human status again, right? Or not just human, because they could be all sorts of races. But you've got this dynamic where you have to have everything is fair and everything works, and then you've got the interface with the rest of the hard, mean universe, which is Starfleet, or what was the name of it?
Special circumstances.
That's
within
right.
the culture spheres. And it's interesting because they have two different kind of like dynamics, whereas like for the vast majority of Star Trek, the Starfleet is really high-minded. They're like, oh, don't want to interfere with the other civilizations, especially early on. And culture's like, no, we don't care. We're gonna like, we have our soft inner, and we have really high-minded ideals within there. But special circumstances, like, yeah, there's a developing civilization over here. They're like medieval tech level. Yeah, we're gonna like put in agents to
boost them up,
and
Yeah.
to change their morality to be something that is more in line with them, so that they're easier to assimilate into their civilization later on.
Yeah. There's a definite difference there. Although, I mean, Starfleet has its moral dilemmas that arise, right?
Right.
I mean, the Prime Directive is brought up so many times because they're always tempted to break it. We can actually
special circumstances, like, yeah, we don't even have that. We're just like, it's very utilitarian, ends justify the means. How can we get this done?
Yeah.
In order to make sure that the internal can continue doing the things that it does.
So back to our planet, back to our present, back to, we've got some, good recommendations for you. If you haven't read Ian Banks' Culture series, you should probably give it a shot if you like that sort of thing. But what we're facing here today is, it's definitely not everything is going swimmingly sort of situation of a post-scarcity future. Instead, we're in some tough times, and people are encountering great psychological stresses and difficulties in facing up to the fact that work is changing for us in very unpredictable, and in the way that it is predictable, seemingly dismal ways. So we should talk about some of the big factors. Do you want to, focus on some of the ones that you think are the most important in this situation?
Well, one of the main things is automation, both in robotics and AI. Like, we produce more than we did in the 80s with like a third of the workforce, or maybe a quarter of the workforce. The output is still up there. We're still, a manufacturing powerhouse, not as much as some other countries, but it's just like the jobs that used to be there are gone.
Yeah.
And then AI is, there's this a term that, software is eating everything. And
now, what does that mean? That's actually a really good slogan.
Yeah. So, just with software, we can automate a whole bunch of things. Like there are robotics, but that all runs in software. You look at like accounting. Lots of accounting is being eaten by software packages that do what accountants used to do. There is a glut of lawyers that have no ability to actually practice law because people like, I want to say it's Siemens, not Siemens. There's a number of companies that do automated document review, and so this used to be a really labor-intensive thing for lawyers. You look through case law, and you look through any relevant documents when you went through discovery, and it was like you just reading and reading and reading and trying to find anything that you could use to support your case. And now they have AI that like scans all the documents and then figures out what is actually relevant and then presents that to you, like a thousandth of the subset of what you would have had to do in the future. And so this was actually where most lawyers got their foot into many law firms as these paralegals.
So that's a really, let's pause on that for a second, because that's a really interesting issue that you put your finger on in talking about getting not just their foot in the door, but getting a kind of training. So something similar happened in the humanities. We talk about the digital humanities, and part of that has been, the putting all of these texts into searchable digital formats, right? So what we do nowadays, if you're studying, say, Cicero, quite often, I mean, I still am kind of old school where I'll go and like look through the book, and I think there's a reference here to something, I just don't remember where it is. But even I will oftentimes do like, word searches, either in the English translation or the Latin, and find exactly what I'm looking for. Now, if you do that, you're missing out on the development of a set of skills. And I'll give you another prime example of this. So students these days, if they have a library that actually has open stacks and volumes that they can go and look in, they don't. They go to the computer and they go to JSTOR for articles, and they, look up, if they need a book, they look up where it is, and then they might go to the shelf and get it down from that place, or they might just request a librarian to go get it for them, and then they pick it up at the front desk. Mm-hmm. And what you miss out on is the dithering around in the stacks, looking at books and saying, oh, that one looks kind of interesting too. I should check that out. Or finding things that you didn't realize were there. Like when I did my research for the one, big academic book that I've published up until this point, I did it at the Notre Dame Hesburgh Library, and I would literally go to a set of volumes that contained the journals from, like, say, 1929 to 1941, and just like page through them. And now this might strike a lot of people. Wow, that was a waste of time. Holy crap, I can't believe that, you did all that. But you find all these other things along the way. And you also, in some sense, learn your craft. So if lawyers are not doing this document review, they're probably losing something important along the way, right? Mm-hmm. And I think we could say this for a lot of other fields as well. Think about tool and die operators. So most of that became, pretty automated in the 90s, where there'd be some fairly primitive, from our perspective, software running things, but you'd still have to know what you're doing. Mm-hmm. Like you said, you don't really need that many people doing this sort of thing. Or if you're doing like plastics, if you're doing molding of things, you put the model into the computer and then, put the right kind of plastic in, and it takes care of it for you. You don't have this getting engaged in the material itself. Or think about car mechanics, right? I mean, they still do some basic things, but a lot of times they like hook the car up to the diagnostics, and they're like, is in like the Little Britain episode, computer says no, right? And then, what's the remedy? Swap out these chips for these chips. So there's a lot of fields where the humans are, in some respect, becoming redundant.
Yeah, it reminds me of listening to Car Talk back in the day. Oh. And he's like, what's this, the noise that you hear? And like, what corner of the car do you think it's coming from? And what's your make and model? And they could like deduce that just from like the sounds and feels and the description of how it rode. Whereas, that is very tactile and very close learning. Yeah. And that is just not there for, I guess, a lot. And to go back to your point on academic learning, that's exactly, like, I've spent very little time just kind of dithering in the stacks.
Yeah.
And I use judicial use of find in text.
Yeah, and I'm not a Luddite. I love the fact that I can get literally tens of thousands of articles at my fingertip just with a few keystrokes. But there is something that's being missed. And I think academics have their own economic problems, but I think that they don't really need to be worried at this point about being replaced by computers. But so many other fields, that is the case.
Right. And it's not just blue collar, it is also white collar. There's a lot of, specifically lawyers is one that's already being eaten. And
can you come up with one that people might have more sympathy with?
Engineers, computer science, a lot of these STEM fields that usually would be considered, those are really good, respectable white collar jobs.
Yeah. The way up for a lot of people, right?
Yeah, and these are things that, like, at least the lower levels will be more automated, and there's already certain neural networks that can do certain programming, and it's like, oh no, what are we doing here?
I was going to say, does that making you sweat a bit or not?
No.
Why not?
Because I like to mess around with making neural networks.
So that's one of the answers that people always put forward, there's the computers are going to take everything over, but it's okay. We're not going to lose jobs because we're still going to need human beings to decide what the computers are going to do and program them. And, when you hear that, you think, okay, they will need some people to do that. What about all the other people? Are we going to create kind of silly jobs for them like George Jetson, where he goes in and his whole job is just to push a single button? Is that really a job? Or is that just kind of like keeping him cooped up so he doesn't go nuts because he's got too much time on his hands?
Right. What's the point? Is just make busy work, and we're already in a point where make busy work is kind of the norm for a large percentage of our population.
That's an interesting observation, and that's one that could have been made a long time ago. I think you're aware of the book, The Peter Principle, right?
Vaguely.
Okay. So it was written, I believe, in the 60s. It might have been even earlier in the 50s. And it was about hierarchical organizations, because back then a lot of business and a lot of, other things, educational, military, were all these fairly well-defined hierarchical organizations, and you'd move up through seniority or, doing a good job or something like that. And, they were kind of command and control is what we would call them. And Peter said that most people within organizations are not actually doing any productive work. And it's because here's the key Peter principle: people will rise to their level of incompetency. So if you're good at the level 1, they'll promote you. And then you might be good at level 2. And if you are good at level 2, they'll promote you again. But if you're not any good at it, you're going to stay at level 2. They're not going to kick you back down to level 1 unless you're a real screw up, because they don't want to admit that they made a mistake in putting you, in promoting you and putting you in a higher place, right? So you get there and then you don't do any really productive work because you're incompetent at what you're doing. So you become a manager, right? You're at a restaurant, you wash dishes, and then maybe you become, you start doing prep and stuff like that, and everything's going great, and then they make you assistant manager, and you're terrible at it, but they're not going to get rid of you as assistant manager, and you don't get any work done, and you get in the way of the other people who do. So his estimate was only 20% of the people in any given organization are actually doing real work. That was a long time ago.
Yeah. And it would make sense that we would find those people that are doing a job really, really well, and maybe just pay them more for that work, because if they are the best at that, then then you should do that. And you go find. So I feel like part of it is that we have these hierarchies, and we have this idea that if you're higher in the hierarchy, you also must have a corresponding increase in your pay, and
maybe exponential, right? These days,
and maybe if you are assistant manager, you're not actually making more than your workers. Maybe there are certain workers that are just really good at their jobs, and those are much more valuable to you, and you might be better for you to just have them keep on doing that and just pay them a little bit more.
Yeah. Peter's suggestion was much more individualistic, which is if you should make sure that you don't rise to your level of incompetence. So you find a spot that you like, and then you start developing some quirks that he called creative incompetence. Start showing up late, or, say weird stuff in meetings or something like that, just to make sure that you're not going to get promoted to the next level. Now, I don't know if that would work today. That might get you fired instead.
Right.
So let's come back to today's stuff. So, one of the things that's really radically changed the landscape of work is the several decades of deregulation, and the fact that companies keep getting, consolidated and bought up. So, when you have a company that is innovative and doing a good job, one of the big tech companies will come along and gobble them up, or they'll be run. We have hospitals that are essentially being run by venture capitalist firms. And this leads to a lot of problems, because the organization is not being run by people who actually want that organization to be doing its main mission. It becomes about making more and more money and being more and more productive. And one of the ways to do that is to start minimizing the number of humans involved. So reducing the number of viable work spots, you could say, right? And
Right.
and this is one of the things that's been coming up as well. Who actually derives the benefits from robotics? It's the people who own the robots.
Mhm.
So it's not like robotics would automatically, or AI or logistics or all these other wonderful things would automatically turn into a better future for all of us. It turns into a better future for whoever owns and directs it. So this is a good transition point, I think, maybe to thinking about what work means for us. Because if people are being put out of work, what are they losing? I mean, we often talk like a job is, on the one hand, a right, although right to work actually means they can fire you whenever they want to.
Right.
Or at will employment, rather, it means that. Right to work means you can't unionize in easy ways. But then, a lot of people really do want to work. They may not want to work the job that they have, or they do want to work the job that they have, but not under the conditions that they have it. What does it mean when people are put out of their jobs? Are jobs something like a basic good that everybody should have access to?
Well, this is kind of like, it kind of depends on which culture you're in. And like the
Yeah.
United States has a very long history from our Puritan roots, and we have this Puritan work ethic. This, I guess our German immigrants also kind of had this a little bit. But the have a job and be employed is to be good. And that feels like it's very pervasive still in this day and age. And if we are looking at a future in which there are fewer and fewer jobs, then there are fewer and fewer people who are like good. You can see this all the time when there's the meme of someone yelling at the homeless person, get a job.
Yeah.
Because they're not, a good person. You're not participating in society.
Yeah, and the idea was also, if you did get a job, you wouldn't be this homeless person, stinking, occupying space, being idle. The job would be sort of like a magical transformation thing that in a month or so, 2 paychecks would suddenly turn you into a productive citizen and member of the community, right?
Right.
And that might have been the case in earlier times. I mean, I remember when I was a college student, if I didn't like a job, I could leave it, and I wouldn't find a great job after that, but guaranteed by the end of the week I'd have some other crappy, anywhere from minimum wage to twice minimum wage job that would pay for the stuff that I wanted to pay for. That just is not the case today. I mean, you have to apply quite often online for positions, and it's a lot harder to get into jobs and hold on to them. So, go ahead.
Another thing is that our health insurance is also tied to our jobs a lot. That also gets you kind of stuck with a job. If you don't like it, you're kind of SOL.
Yeah.
And this is actually a funny thing. I own my house, and it's a triplex. And if I don't want to work, I can rent it out, and I can subsist on the rent. It's not a great subsistence, but at least it allows me that opportunity that I will know that I will not starve if I don't have a job, and so it's my FU house, and just the ability to say I don't need this job to any employer, which is kind of this rarefied position that not a lot of people actually have.
Yeah, and it's interesting because that is one of the things that has changed. There have always been people who are kind of screwed, right? Mm-hmm. Maybe the big employer was the only real employer in town, so if they don't want to work at the mill, well, they've got to move somewhere else, and all their friends and family live there. So, but for most people, I would say in our society, decades back, you could move if you really needed to. You could move from job to job. It's not quite so easy today. So there's less jobs available. I mean, it's kind of funny because people say, well, I know that the jobs aren't very good because I've got 3 of them. and the gig economy is another big part of this as well, where people are not even being treated as if they are employees. There's lawsuits, still pending about this, like with Uber and other things. Instead, they're treated as private contractors who are totally responsible for what goes on their end. And it displaces a lot of the burden onto them. So we are, we're really we're just charting out like a few features of the situation that we're heading into. Mm-hmm. What is it going to look like for us? And what does a job do for a person? Part of it is it supplies them an income. But it does more than that. Like you were saying just a minute ago, it signifies them as like a worthy person in society to others.
To have value.
Yeah. And I think also it's something internal as well. A lot of people want to be productive. They want to have something they can do. Sometimes they're not in a job that lets them do that. And they might get a little burnt out because of that or be disengaged. But not having a job at all, that really does a number on so many people.
Yeah, not to mention, like, what's the first thing that you ask when you meet someone? A lot of times it's, what do you do? And
what do you say when you don't have a what do you do?
I don't know. I'm a part-time amateur philosopher or something.
People started having to come up with all sorts of answers to that in the recession from, that started essentially in 2007 and then continued on for a while. And that was for a lot of people the first time they'd been out of work, not for like 2 weeks, but for months and months on end, sometimes years on end. And they would say things like, I'm between positions right now. And then when somebody says that, a lot of people look at them, oh, okay, so you're basically a bum. You're unemployed, And so people got creative with other things. Oh, I've got a lot of irons in the fire,
Yeah.
But
it's like, once again, this trying to decouple your identity and your value from the work is probably something that we can work on as a society.
Now, why? Why is that so important in your view?
Well, meaning is very powerful in how people's mental health as well as the things that are driving him. And so there's a movement to try to decouple meaning from work. And so the idea of, especially like the purpose of earning money is to have enough money to live.
Yeah.
And maybe the purpose of work should be to create. And so if you're decoupling the making of money from that making of work, then now you can have something that you're creating and you're putting meaning into that is not directly associated with this. How do I make sure that there's food on my table and a roof over my head?
Yeah. And this is a perennial issue. This goes way, way back. I mean, Plato in the Republic, he talks about the difference between different arts or sciences or disciplines, technes and epistemes in Greek, ways of like knowing how to do something, like medicine, for example. And he says, the doctor is not about making money. Insofar as he's just about making money, he's not really a doctor. The art of medicine is about healing the body or producing whatever is supposed to be produced in the body. And so focusing on that productive aspect and not just on having to figure out how to make money or how to turn what you've got into essentially a money-making knack, that would really change the meaning for a lot of people. But that also sounds kind of utopian. It's sort of like, or not necessarily utopian, sort of elitist or privileged. Well, it's nice if you've got the kind of career that lets you do that, but what about the rest of us poor working people who can't do that?
And that's
think about
where we're going with this potential post-scarcity economy. If we do have automation and we have the ability that the benefits of this automation are actually given to everyone, then it does give everyone the opportunity to do that. And when you remove the need to have money from your work, it allows you to do work in a more authentic way. And without the problem of money, you do your work out of love.
Yeah, and because you have a talent or affinity for it, right?
Right.
Now, this is a good place for us to jump into talking about, there's a number of different, it seems like the futurists and analysts, they love to talk in fours. I think because you can usually have a square then and it's a nice graphic. So one theorist who wrote about this in Jacobin, and then wrote a book later on, is Peter Frase. I think I'm pronouncing his name right. And he was talking about 4 different possible futures for us. And he was being a bit more imaginative than a lot of the other 4s that we're going to talk about, where they say, oh, everyone's going to have to work. It's just a question of how it's going to happen. He talks about 2 different variables that give us something like a square. You've got resource abundance versus scarcity, and egalitarianism versus hierarchy. And he says these are, ideal types. These are not supposed to be like everything's going to happen exactly this way. But the universe that you're talking about, or the possible world, a post-scarcity future like that of Star Trek, would be that where we have both abundance of natural resources and, things can be coordinated properly, and egalitarianism, where we value people equally and we don't simply impose force or power on them. And that's what would be needed in order to have something like Star Trek, right?
Right. And this is kind of like there's scarcity is one of the major factors within like a capitalist system, and if you remove scarcity, then it kind of removes the reason why there should be prices for things in order to try to dole those goods out to the right amount of people. And if there's basically infinite goods, then basically everyone could have whatever they want. They could consume as much as they want.
Yeah. And this is a possible future for us when we have all these, robotics and AIs in place. If we, as a society, decide that everybody's valued and everybody gets to do the kind of work that they want to do and everybody gets what they need, then we could have that. What stands in the way of that?
Well, who owns the automation is, I guess, the main thing. Otherwise there's some sort of inability to get enough resources to be the inputs for this automation. So I don't know, we blow up the moon and make most of the world uninhabitable, and now
wow.
I don't know.
Yeah, so another one of the options that he talks about, where you have egalitarianism but you also have scarcity. Like maybe we do burn through our fossil fuels, and if we burn through the fossil fuels, there go the plastics too, pretty much, because
right.
they're made from petroleum too.
Although we can get that from plants, not the same kind, but
the plants need fossil fuels in order for us to grow them, right? So we're still kind of SOL. So he talks about that as being socialism. And he says nobody needs to perform labor, but people are not free to consume as much as they like. So we have to have like shrinking the belt, but we do it in an equal way. So everybody, pitches in. Now, what if we have hierarchy?
Then we have two. We have either abundance or scarcity. And so hierarchy and abundance would be rentism. This is, where there's a very few people who own all the automation capital. And now if they need no labor, then there's a decoupling between the fortunes of the capitalists and the fortune of those people that are part of the labor force. And because you don't need the labor anymore, and you just basically turn this into renterism.
Yeah, and there's like a prestige system, you could say, right? They want to hold on to some sort of distinctives that make them better than everybody else.
Mm-hmm. And so the last one here is a hierarchy and scarcism, which is like the worst of all worlds here.
Yeah, he calls it exterminism, and he characterized it as a communism for the few. And the idea is if we really do have a world where we're using up all the resources, well, that works out good for the rich or the powerful or the well-connected, because they can find ways to either what do they
mitigate any of the negatives of the scarcity.
Yeah, for themselves.
Right.
And then everybody else can, as they say, pound sand. I was thinking about bread and circuses, right? You keep the mass entertained and out of your way, or you put them somewhere else, or you just get rid of them.
You see this kind of interestingly with a lot of tech millionaires and billionaires doing prepperism and buying bunkers in the middle of nowhere, kind of expecting this social crash at some point in time. And they feel like, well, they're going to come for our heads, so we better have some place to hold up, enough arms, and maybe some private security away from everyone else.
Yeah, it's interesting when you think about the private security. What's their incentive to stay loyal in that case?
Right, especially if like, for example, if the dollar goes into the toilet,
what are you going to pay them?
It's like, right, I mean, you better have like a whole bunch of spam.
Yeah.
But like, once the spam's the only thing and he's the guy with the gun, what's keeping him from saying, well, no, just give me the spam?
Yeah, and so this is kind of a really, really big picture dividing up of what our possible futures would be. But, I think part of his point was we have to be attuned to the fact that things could go one way or the other, and it depends on what we as a society opt for or push for.
And it's interesting because this is like recent politics with Andrew Yang has been talking a lot about this idea, and he kind of stakes out a position between this egalitarianism and abundance and a hierarchy in abundance, because he's like, okay, there's automation, it's happening, and so his idea to put forward was a freedom dividend. Basically, instead of actually, making all the automation directly under the control of the government, and this would be like your straight up capitalism.
Yeah.
That you still have, communism, but you still have like capitalist system, but you just tax the heck out of the automation and say, we built this system together and we should then reap the benefits of the system together.
Yeah. It's interesting if you think about the logic of that and you were to like put it right in the present, who would you be taxing? The huge tech companies, right? Because they already have massive. It's not a lot of robots necessarily doing everything, although they're trying to move as quickly as possible to that. But if you think about the amount of data that Amazon, Facebook, Google, Apple, and Microsoft collect on us through either directly themselves or all their subsidiaries, and all of the money that they're bringing in, very little of which is actually taxed and thereby used for socially beneficial purposes. That's where the freedom dividend could come from, Right. But I don't see Yang saying that. Or am I wrong?
I'm not sure. I think he's more worried about manufacturing.
Yeah.
Than automation.
This is a little bit off topic, but who do we think is actually going to do the manufacturing and own all the robots? Is it likely that it's going to be new companies rising up, or is it likely it's going to be these massive tech conglomerates who are the biggest, capitalized? They have the largest market caps in all of history and in the current economy. They effectively dominate the economy. What do you think? I think
it's going to be a mix of some old companies and some new ones that find a niche that will explode into this. There's what do they call it? The massive pool of money, and this is kind of back from The Big Short, which is about the 2008 financial crisis. And one of the reasons why there was so much demand for these tranched housing mortgages was that there's like several $1 trillion of money just in bank accounts, especially at least in that time in China, that were looking for some place to get a return. And so there's a lot of potential liquid capital out there for if someone has a really good idea that could, have that 10x return, it could definitely happen.
Okay. Yeah, so that makes sense. A combination of both. Let's talk about, because I don't think we're going to have time to talk about all three of the things that we were looking at. Let's talk about something that the Brits came up with from the Royal Society's Action and Research Center report. They talked about 4 futures of work. Now here it's less big picture and a little bit more zooming in. They talked about 4 different scenarios or economies that would still involve a lot of people being at work.
This is looking forward to 2035.
Which, that's in our lifetime. I think that's kind of a realistic window. Might happen before that.
Right. Things diverge the farther we go out.
So they talked about what they called the big tech economy, the precision economy, the exodus economy, and the empathy economy. And let's talk about the last one first, because it sounds like it's a little bit along the way of the post-scarcity Star Trek one, right?
Yeah. I guess, what would you consider the major tenets of that one?
So they talk about in the report that it involves a future of responsible stewardship. So technology doesn't just run away, right? And it's not purely market driven. So it's not driven by the two forces of, holy crap, can we do this really cool thing? Or, wow, we can make a ton of money with this. There's some humane values involved, right? And they're cognizant of what the technology could do that would be bad. And tech companies self-regulate to keep some moral compass. Now, this might be a little utopian. I see you look a little skeptical right now.
I'm very skeptical of, at least all the tech companies. Some of them might try to self-regulate. Google used to have the motto of "Don't be evil."
Totally vacuous.
Yeah. Well, I think they actually meant it in the beginning.
Yeah.
But so much in time, you either you die quick enough to be the hero, or you live long enough to be the villain.
Yeah.
And not even if you had a couple tech companies that were moral, there's always those people that are out there that are like, well, if they're not going to do it, I don't have the moral scruples to not do it, and so I'll go out and do this thing.
Yeah, so I don't think you can accomplish this without some sort of oversight and regulation, But if that happened, so, there would be all this innovation and development, and we would be in a different world in 2035. But like they say, you'd have a lot of funds flowing into what they call these empathy sectors, which I think are very important. Education, right? Every 20 years, we got to relearn everything for a new generation. Care for others, and then also entertainment. So that would be one outcome. And okay,
it's kind of interesting, looking at Japan, which has a very large elderly population, and they're throwing so much money into that sector of their economy, also adding in automation to that to try to make robots that are doing home care and whatnot. And it kind of comes down to, what is your optimization function? Are you optimizing just for the profits, or are there other things that we as a society and as an economy need to optimize for? And for a long time, I believe that profits were coupled very strongly with overall well-being. But if you get to the extremes here, I think that reverses, and they decouple harshly, especially if only a few people have all of the capital and they don't need any of the labor.
And when you're saying they decouple, you mean that there's almost an inverse relation with one, where the more profits you're making, the less well-being there is, right?
Right.
Okay, yeah.
I guess overall well-being.
I'd say that's right. And one of the things maybe we need to think about is, well, how do you, when these things have been separated apart from each other for decades, how do you get them back together again? Because that's a challenge for us as we're moving into this new world. Let's talk about some of the other economies. So they also talk about the big tech economy, which is where the technologies develop at a rapid pace. There's significant improvements in quality of products, public services, and unemployment and economic insecurity start creeping upward. And workers and unions are basically just stuck. There's not much that they can do about it. That seems to be where we are going as the default if we're not careful.
Yeah, like look at the gig economy, and
Yeah.
there's a whole bunch of workers that are really full-time workers, but they're independent contractors, and thus they have no leverage over the employers slash contract holders that they actually work for.
Yeah. So another one that they talk about that's also rather dystopic is the exodus economy, where you would have some sort of economic slowdown. And this could be the case. I mean, they're talking about for Britain. That could happen here. That can happen in China. That can happen in any of the big drivers. And you can get a vicious cycle where there's less money in the economy, less innovation. And what happens?
Which prompts the government to then impose austerity, which then stifles the economy, and it goes and goes.
Yeah,
I guess you saw that in like Greece and Italy, right?
Yeah, yeah. How does that affect the ordinary person as opposed to the captain of industry, right? Well, there's less opportunities for them, and they may find themselves without work just because there's not enough work to go around. So.
And it's interesting that they expect, if this were to happen, then cooperatives and mutuals would emerge in large number to serve the people's core economic needs in food, energy, and banking.
Do you think that's too optimistic?
I find it interesting, of these four, that's the only one where it came up. And that it seems like some of these different ways of structuring our economy and who shares in the benefits of our economy could that cooperatives and mutuals could be potential release valves for moving away from one of our worst positions. Maybe that's why they put it. It's if it says the people become disillusioned with capitalism, and so they move to really fundamentally different forms of economy.
It's interesting. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but when I talk with my students, Gen Z students, they will say things to me quite routinely like, what do I care about the capitalist economy? What's it doing for me? And you can do the devil's advocate that, well, look at all the innovation. And they're like, man, I'm so cut off from all that sort of stuff. It's not helping me really at all. And this lack of buy-in is going to be a real problem, I think. Let's talk very quickly about the precision economy. This is what their way of talking about what they call a future of hyper surveillance. So this is when you're being monitored all the time. Like, for instance, when you work from home, looking through the webcam, somebody's watching to see whether your eyes are actually on the document that you're supposed to be doing or whether you're watching a YouTube video.
Right.
So what that may be the future of work for many of us. I hope not.
I hope not as well. And especially because this idea that we should be at our desks for 8 hours is a relic of a factory job, where if you weren't at the factory on the line, then you weren't getting anything productive done. But especially when we're doing a lot of thinking-based work that they already say that you only work an office job 40% of the time if you're actually being productive. Go back to that Peter principle.
Yeah.
So
but you're also onto something that we also probably do need, these ebbs and flows, right? You can't all be peak performance all the time, or we're going to burn out very quickly.
And so a number of companies have moved to just an output base, and they don't care how much you actually sit down and work. They're like, okay, well, you need, here's our outline of say your programming. It's I need to have a function that does this. And it's okay, I did that. And okay, good. You're in good sorts. Here's your salary. And so it's not like you have to be sitting there and looking at code for 8 hours.
Yeah.
I totally agree. It ebbs and flows. If I'm looking at code for 8 hours, I'm going to burn out.
Yeah, and you might actually only get those top levels of the waves, if we're using this ebb and flow metaphor, by having those troughs. Right. So if you don't have that, then it has to like be lowered down. But part of the problem with the economy that we're in, because there's this emphasis on like, gotta always have more and more productivity. I think we've actually hit with the human element of things. In many cases, we've already hit like peak productivity. You know, you can make things a little bit more effective here and there, and do all sorts of flow charts and use task management software. But I don't think you're going to get that much more out of people than you currently are in many cases.
Those diminishing returns.
Yeah. So this surveillance economy would be trying to, I guess, squeeze everything possible out of the workers, which is going to suck for the people who are living within it, right?
Yeah, it's the kind of idea of like being always on, always putting on this fake face to make sure, especially if you're customer facing, if you're being constantly rated, Black Mirror did it.
Yeah, I was gonna say,
but actually, before
right?
Black Mirror on Community did it with the Meow Meow Bees.
Tell me about that, because I didn't watch Community. I watched like a first couple seasons, I think, and then I something happened. I just tuned out.
There was an episode in which Tim and Eric from the Tim and Eric Show, if you're familiar, were starring, and then they might have actually helped write it, but it was basically that episode of Black Mirror where basically they got an app and everyone was constantly rating each other, and it turned into kind of this like post-apocalyptic 5 stars versus 3, 2, 1, and 4, obviously.
Can't forget
down
the
to
4s.
like 0. Yeah. But like it like turned into this caste system where the 5 stars were all like getting constantly pampered because their 5-starness gave more power to give anyone else because their ratings were weighted higher.
Interesting. Yeah, so that is definitely a danger there. Let's talk. I think before we talk about a challenge or practice that people could put into play, let's talk about why all of this is important. So we've been doing a lot of discussion of very big picture stuff. How does this impact the ordinary person who might be listening to the show and wants to hear how philosophy is helping to improve their life? Well, I mean, go ahead.
Oh, it's just like there's I guess 2 major components. There's the material necessity of the individual or their families, getting that food on the table, getting warm clothes to put on your children's backs, and then there's the the meaning component. And if a lot of this are going to be trying to figure out how are we going to be going forward in our world and meeting those 2 needs.
Yeah. And so for the first need, the economic, the putting food on the table and roof over the head and all these proverbial things, wheels on your car, whatever it's going to be, I guess you can say that, that you can look at it in a very individualistic way. I need to do what's going to be helpful for me or perhaps for my family. But you can also look at it in a more group-oriented way where you're like, well, what could we do together to make things more humane, to set up buffers where we're not all sort of exposed to the elements of the marketplace and just a couple steps away from not having what we need, and this might require more organization. And I don't know right now that our current labor unions are the device to do that, but I don't have anything else to say other than that there's other alternatives out there that people can explore. Yeah,
like labor unions are to a certain extent kind of dinosaurs. They're a relic of a previous age in which labor was much more strongly tied to your employment. You would work at the same job for 40 years and you'd retire.
What do you think about the idea of some of the other attempts to unionize things like Uber or some of these other tech companies? Do you see prospects there for creating a buffer where people are going to be less subject to the vicissitudes of the marketplace? Or
I don't know if they're ever going to work. It's like I wish that there was a better balance between the political power of labor and capital, and I think that could definitely improve the overall working conditions of the worker.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure if the way that our system is currently set up that it actually allows for that to happen.
Yeah. So, I mean, then some people are like, well, screw the system, But I don't know that that's that viable of a response. Coming back to the other side of it, though, the meaning side, I think a lot of people are very vulnerable because we still do, in fact, tie our meaning of ourselves as workers to the work that we do and to the availability of work. So this is something that happened, in a major way in the 2008 recession. Many people who had never really been out of work for a long time found themselves unable to find anything for months and months on end, and sometimes for years, and it did incredible psychological damage to those people. Now, why was that the case? Because they identified themselves so closely with their earning potential, or having a title, or having a place to go where you have an office. So right. What would you say people ought to do?
Well, you should either develop a non-work goal for your life and derive meaning from that, or as I spoke about I think last week, the paper I wrote, which I believe is called The Locust of Meaning, which I tried to make this argument that you should have an abstraction that like a category in which you could fit your meaning, and one way that it would manifest would be your work, but you could also have that manifest in many other ways that are non-work related.
That was in Stoicism Today, right?
Right.
So we'll put a link to that for people who are listening, so you can track that down and you don't have to try to Google it. And I like that approach to it, which is, some of your meaning could be in your work. You just don't want to have all of the eggs in that one single basket like Willy Loman, because then it's going to be a death of a salesman. You could have, one egg in this basket and one egg in this basket and one in what they call diversification, right? In investing. That seems to be a rather prudent thing to do. Now, that touches on the practice that we were going to talk about. So say a little bit more about picking a non-work goal for your life. What does that mean?
So this came to the idea of like decoupling your work from your meaning, and so you can think of like finding a hobby, maybe something that you can constantly be learning about, and this idea of like maybe try to promote a lifelong learning. Be someone that would be an autodidact. And so, for example, like I found that in philosophy, I find it very enjoyable. It is definitely not my job, but I do derive a lot of meaning from it. I look forward to having this conversation with Greg weekly much more than I do going to work.
Well, that's a nice recommendation. And even for somebody like myself who's, paid to do philosophy, I don't actually have to study most of the stuff that I study. I could just focus in on the things that I'm actually getting paid to. But I like reading some other things on the side and thinking about them. And I think there really is something to this idea of finding something where it's not just about the output. That becomes like a rock that you can rely upon when, as is probably going to happen to all of us, we're out of work.
Mm-hmm. Well, and also at the end, like when we retire, like what do you do once you retire?
Yeah, that may be a whole other conversation that we need to have down the line. So we don't actually have any quote or quip to go out on. Any word of wisdom you want to impart before we go?
Vidi vidi vici. Here comes AI to Came, Saw, and Conquer.
Oh, so it's the AI saying that, right?
Yeah.
Now, when the AI can actually say that and mean it, it truly will be AI.
Right. All right. Be well.